Hello and welcome back to HEMAFightBreakdowns. Today I'm going to be breaking down the Tier A Longsword Final Round Robin match of IGX 2024. If you don't know what that means, it means IGX didn't really have a gold medal match. What it did have was a series of longsword matches between, I think, 4 or maybe 5 people in a pool, where the winner was the person who did the best while fencing all the people in what was essentially the top 5. But this was one of the fights that I found to be the most interesting, and one of the ones where I get to talk a little bit about rules and quality and whether or not this concept that some people throw around called like tippy-tappy fencing is really something to be worried about or something to just move on with. So our first exchange is a pretty chaotic one. We have a lot of back and forth from both fencers where both are throwing strikes that I would call just on the line of uncommitted. Now, what a lot of people mean when they talk about tippy-tappy fencing is they mean strikes that are uncommitted. And sometimes this can be a real serious problem. But if you watch this in the slow motion, as you're doing right now, what you'll notice is that every single one of these cuts, whether they be to the head or to the hands or as a thrust, always came about within an inch or so of their opponent. And what that means is that while, yes, the cut or the thrust was not committed, it does mean that it allows an opening where this could have been a more than sufficient cut if it had been 1 inch closer. Now, the problems with commitment is that a lot of times you'll see people overcommit or sometimes undercommit like they're doing here, but you don't see a whole lot of people who fence at this kind of middle range where they're trying very desperately to fence at that 1 inch past the committed range and basically wait for their opponent to walk into a cut or a thrust or whatever it may be. So as we're watching this exchange, and we're seeing these two fencers exchange their blows, you're seeing every single one miss by a little bit or an inch or more. And what happens at the end is that eventually, blue fencer on the left here manages to push yellow fencer on the right all the way towards the edge of the ring, at which point a commitment is forced to happen. Now, in my opinion, the only real blow that matters here is one of the ones that yellow threw in a kind of thrust that blue appeared to have walked into. But when it comes to criticizing fencing, I don't believe in throwing out any kind of style or especially matchup because, as it probably happens to be, both of these fencers are rather defensive and they both like fencing at that just outside of commitment range. So when two of those people who happen to fence a similar way fight each other, it might look to a lot of people that these are two people who are really just not trying to fence each other at all, and they're just kind of swinging at the air a little bit. But I would push back on that and say that these are two people who have a very particular style in the way that they fence, and you can tell through some of the minor amounts of commitments that they give that they are astutely aware of the fact that both of their blows are not really quite making it all the way, given the fact that many of them pause after they throw one, and simply give them a little bit of advice that if you're ever in this situation, whether you're them or anybody else, and you find yourself constantly missing by an inch or more, it probably means that both yourself and your opponent are trying to fence without commitment. And the first person to start trying to commit is probably going to get the better of the exchange. For our next exchange, it seems as though the fencer on the right can hear me through the video screen and immediately comes forward with a very well committed attack. And this is where we get a really nice demonstration of the very typical adaptation that someone should make when they find themselves in the position that these two fencers found themselves in the first exchange. Namely, where they're both not really committing to anything and they're finding that their opponent is matching that pace. By driving forward with a nice thrust, what it essentially does is it makes sure that your opponent, who up until now has been fencing without much commitment, is probably going to throw something that is going to try to either set you off or attack you at the exact same time. But because you know that the range will not be completely there, you know that it's not really threatening to you. And coming forward with a nice, good thrust is a good idea. Now, fencer on the right comes forward with that thrust. Fencer on the left tries to set it off to their right side, but they kind of get it caught in their arm a little bit. But another thing to pay attention to here is that even after this thrust lands or doesn't land because it gets stuck in the gear, fencer on the right still winds up and defends themselves from any afterblow. And this is, again, another secret solution to the kinds of problems we saw in the first exchange. Coming forward with commitment can often feel like a very risky maneuver because of the risk of doubles. And that is why a lot of people fence with this particular style, where they don't try to commit to any one thing very heavily. But the problem here, and the solution, is that it is actually entirely possible to fight with commitment and then still cover yourself afterwards. You have to try to separate the concept of commitment from the concept of defense, because while they are directly related most of the time, they are not mutually exclusive. For our third exchange, we see yet another adaptation from the fencer on the right that really starts to dial in one of the other problems with non-committal fencing styles, and that is its propensity to be vulnerable to one-handed attacks. Now, one-handed attacks have the benefit, usually, of range and a confusion factor. A lot of times people look at what you're doing with your body to try to determine what kind of attack you're making. But when you throw an attack with only one hand on your sword, it often can confuse a defensive person into trying to do a parry or a block that isn't actually effective against one thing, but is against another. In this case, fencer on the right comes forward, one-handed stabs, just walks it straight into the chest, but fencer on the left tries to do a bit of a wide crumpow. And what I mean by that is they windshield wiper from their left side to their right side in an attempt to set aside what would normally be a thrust. But because the thrust from the fencer on the right was one-handed, it had an extra 8 to 10 inches of reach, which means it's reached its target long before the crumpow from fencer on the left would have been reasonable. And despite the fact that fencer on the left was walking forward while they threw this defensive measure, it was still one that isn't threatening at all to fencer on the right. Again, following along with this kind of out of measure, no commitment fencing style. And the problem with this, again, is not only, as we said before, that someone who does commit into someone who's not committing has a little bit of danger on their side, but you can also commit with a huge amount of risk factor when you're throwing a one-handed strike, and that risk factor is completely mitigated if you know that your opponent isn't going to commit on you. Now, I skipped an exchange in here, and this is not the next one chronologically, but it is the next one that I find particularly interesting, and I find it interesting because both of these fencers go back to the same kind of non-committal fencing style that we saw in the first exchange. Fencer on the right, though, seems to have a slightly different version of non-committal fencing than fencer on the left, and I want to delve a little bit deeper into what that really means. Now, first off, I want to look at fencer on the right, and the ways that they try to throw what I would call get away from me strikes. Not to try to sound condescending, because they really are very effective, but I would call a get away from me strike any kind of strike where you're backing up and you're throwing something at a target that you assume is going to be there if your opponent continues to come forward aggressively. 90% of the time, these kinds of strikes go towards the hands, and that's for a very good reason. Most people, when they're coming forward with an aggressive attack, especially one to a deep target, will raise their hands up in front of the level of their shoulders in preparation for their attack. Raising your hands up into that position often exposes your hands and your arms to strikes, which means that if someone is coming at you and you want them to get away from you, throwing a little non-committal hand strike can be a really great way of getting free points while backing up and staying safe. So it's a pretty smart thing to do. And the same thing goes for thrusts. If someone is walking towards you and you just kind of put your point in their face, you're probably not going to extend far enough forward to actually reach them. But if they continue to come forward, again, in a preparatory motion for an attack, there's a pretty decent chance they might just walk directly into your point. So there's really nothing wrong with this kind of fencing, as long as you understand that if you don't commit to anything, you're really waiting on the mistake of your opponent in order to make them lose, rather than anything you're doing to make yourself win. Now contrast that with the fencing from the fencer on the left. Right off the bat, they are standing off in left plow, thumb grip, thumb on top of the sword, as I've talked about before, and they seem to be throwing this one strike over and over again in another non-committal preparatory way, but one where they are not taking advantage of this kind of get away from me principle. When you watch them fight, what you see them do is they keep gesturing up with the flat of their blade towards the hands of their opponent. And aside from the fact that they're doing this with the flat up and they're just throwing flat strikes over and over again, even if this is a tournament where flat strikes are allowed, which does happen sometimes, I don't feel like this is accomplishing the goal that fencer on the left really wants to be using it for. Because in my opinion, the reason you would throw these strikes to the bottom of somebody's hands, whether they're edge on or flat on, is because you also want to use this get away from me principle. You want to throw strikes in such a way that if the fencer on the right here were to throw a thrust, they would throw their hands directly into the undercut that is coming up that fencer on the left is throwing. So it makes sense in that way that it could be a get away from me thrust. But The part that's missing is the part where you're backing away and where you're relying on your opponent to move their targets into your targets rather than simply allow them to move into measure. And the key difference here is that, as we saw in this exchange, eventually, when Fencer on the right did throw a thrust, Fencer on the left was successful in tapping them on the hands with their undercut, only for them to get plowed in the chest with a thrust and fall backwards. And the reason this happened is because every time Fencer on the left was throwing their get away from me strikes, they were doing so while moving forward and doing a little mini lunge with it. And in my opinion, this is what separates the stylistic differences between these two fencers, and in this exchange explains why one was successful in using this kind of methodology and another one was not. So this next exchange is the last one, but it's another one where we get to talk about get away from me style fencing. And we see a very similar situation play out as the previous exchange. Fencer on the left is continually dipping their point and trying to throw these short edge or flat edge cuts to the bottom of the hands of Fencer on the right. But Fencer on the right makes another adaptation here that takes advantage of the get away from me style fencing, especially the kind that we're seeing from Fencer on the left, in a new and unique way, and that is with footwork traps. So, as a lot of people probably know, footwork is one of the bases for all fencing, but it's a little bit hard to teach people how to use footwork effectively to win an exchange. But this is a pretty great demonstration of that. Now, I called it a footwork trap because what it does is it utilizes the psychological thing that people seem to have ingrained in their head, which is that whenever one person does something, you try to match. So when one person moves backwards, you move forward to try to close the distance. When one person moves forward, you move backwards to try to open the distance. And you try to maintain that over and over again. But of course, human beings are not psychic. And every time somebody moves forward, there's about a quarter second to half second delay before you can effectively start moving. Now, for a lot of people, this delay isn't enough to get in a good offensive or defensive action. But what you can do is you can feint footwork. So what we see here from Fencer on the right is that they start to move backwards towards the end of this exchange, but they don't actually complete their step. And the reason they don't do it is that Fencer on the left sees them start to move backwards and immediately starts to move forward to match. However, because Fencer on the right has feinted their footwork and laid this trap, they have not actually moved backwards at all. They simply moved their back foot, but their front foot didn't go anywhere, which means that they have effectively tricked their opponent into walking into range without an attack. And the thing about walking into range is that it means any attack that you do throw is now fully committed, even if you didn't intend for it to be. You can probably see how this is a great counter to the get away from me style of fencing that we've been seeing up till now, because what it does is it forces Fencer on the left here into a two-part conundrum that they can't really get out of. One, they've accidentally walked into measure without putting forward any threat, but that can happen in a lot of different kinds of fencing. But what they've also done is they've utilized the fact that Fencer on the left has always been throwing these non-committal get away from me style attacks and put them in a position where not only have they moved too close, but the kind of get away from me style attack that they try to throw is also too close and too timed without a backward motion to actually be successful. In this particular case, Fencer on the left tries to throw a stop thrust while they are walking forward, but after their foot has already landed, and of course, after they've already been hit in the head. And the result is that even if they had tried to do one of these little undercuts that they've been doing this entire time, chances are it would not have landed very well. And that's because this get away from me style fencing really does require that backwards momentum in order to be effective. And this footwork trap that has been employed by Fencer on the right has been absolutely astronomically effective at dismantling both of the features of get away from me style fencing at the core. So it was a really cool fight. Hopefully, as I said in the beginning, you don't have some kind of distaste for tippy-tappy fencing. If you do, you probably suck. But what's more important is that if you're looking at somebody who is doing this style of fencing and you want to beat it, well, now hopefully you know some ways to get around it. And if you, like Fencer on the left, find that your game revolves around this kind of fencing, it might be a good idea to learn a few of these footwork traps so that you can incorporate them into your own fencing style. But if you want to see another video like this, you can see it published around Thursday, where I will have more coverage of some more tournaments.